Hey, this is Aaron Price, the CEO of TechUnited New Jersey, and on today's show we have Angelo Stracquatanio, whose name I still can't seem to get right. He's the founder and CEO of Apprentice.io. Angelo, thanks for joining us today. How did I do in the second take?
It was great. It was great, Aaron, and excited to be here today and thrilled to kind of get into it.
Apprentice has had a huge role in the vaccine development and deployment, and so I want to lean in on some of the lessons learned here. So let's get right into it. First, for those who aren't familiar with Apprentice, can you share what is Apprentice? What is it? What do you do?
Yeah, absolutely. So to kind of share more about what Apprentice does, I want to talk about what's happened to pharma. And you'll see how this directly connects to what we do and, more importantly, the vaccine and where it kind of came from. So pharma has gone through some pretty major changes over the last number of years. Effectively, we went from pill making, like your Tylenols, Advils, Claritins, to then over the last decade and a half, biologics, which instead of mixing things together and pressing into pill form, which is what most people think of when they think of pharma, biologics are actually grown. They're living cells that create these drugs over time, and that eventually gets turned into a drug that you can use. But what's even more remarkable is this industry has moved towards personalized medicine now, where there's even a drug made for me and a drug made for you. And so in that kind of radical shift, Apprentice has created a backbone piece of software to help increase the speed to market for some of these incredibly important, both cancer drugs, diabetes drugs, Alzheimer's drugs, and of course the COVID vaccine, to help increase the speed to market so that these therapies can be used for patients around the world. And our software in particular, though, is designed specifically to help orchestrate this and manage this shift from pill making, which is a small molecule, to biologics, which is wholly complex, wholly difficult, and even now into this future world of personalized medicine. And so, our software is really kind of created to help increase speed to market, which last year was, of course, and right now still, speed is incredibly important.
So a lot of directions to go here. So first, on what is traditionally, or what has been traditionally, the way that biologics have been developed. And what I think is so interesting here that we're going to get into is how is treating the process more like a software development type process, accelerated the development. But let's start with, what's the traditional approach?
Sure. So for the folks that are listening in, ordinarily, if you were to look at a project plan for a vaccine, it very much looks like a waterfall. Stage one is development, and development usually does take a very long time. A normal drug uses many different multitude of techniques to identify the appropriate targets, which then you're going to get turned into that first candidate, which then will get taken into the different phases of clinical trials. And there's a number of different phases, which we'll get to in a minute. But if you really think about it, it's always stepwise. Step one, research, which can take several years to find that first candidate. Then step two is getting all the regulatory items ready to then go through and start the clinical trials. Step three then is all the recruitment of the trials, and then moving along for phase one, then two, then three. And then in behind all of that is all of the actual manufacturing, which is where we are, right? Because just because the target molecule got discovered, quote unquote, still needs to be manufactured for the clinical trials. That material still needs to get created. And there's a big difference between the discovery, which happens on a lab bench. Think of it like back to high school, chemistry and biology class. That's where the discovery phase in terms of its scale happens. And there's a whole massive process to figure out how it scales up. And that whole scale up process, again, is very waterfall driven, and there's a whole stepwise function. So now you're into the discovery is 1 to 3 years. You get clinical trials, which can be multi-year, 1 to 4. And then you got to get ready for commercial manufacturing, which in and of itself goes through a whole qualification, tech transfer, setup, you name it, process to get ready to then produce at the scale that was discovered during the trials. So what's so fascinating about this is that we went effectively from a waterfall-based technique or approach that is over the course of almost 10 years for a typical vaccine or a typical drug, And effectively, we went from waterfall to taking all of that and stacking it all at the exact same time. So every single parallel track was happening in parallel last year. So discovery was happening effectively the same time as regulatory, which was happening at the same time as clinical recruitment, which was the same time as clinical manufacturing, which was the same time as commercial manufacturing, which was the same time as hell, even supply chain and logistics and packaging. Everything happened at the same time. So in a way, it was just like software engineering in a sense where not only was there the pace of iteration was unbelievably high, but also too the ways in which these teams were effectively cut up and created and stacked all at the same time. There's a lot of analogies there and a lot of parallels to how software gets created, where you have different modules, you have matrix-based teams, you have pods, you have all this stuff in software development. And that's what they did. They stacked the whole thing on top of itself and went from a waterfall to a giant stack that all happened at the exact same time. I mean, it was
so many questions
challenge.
here. So like in the beginning, right? I mean, I at one point, I believe you've shared with me that it was almost like this was done on a notepad, sort of. I mean, the visual in my head was kind of handed from one department to the other. I don't know if that was literal or not, but it seemed like a very old school, approach. And is that the case? I mean, how non-digitized was the approach? Maybe a year prior to COVID.
So prior to COVID, this industry in general, because again, it's going through so many of these radical shifts, right? We're going from the Tylenols of the world to the biologics of the world to now the personalized medicines of the world. That shift in this industry has not really coincided with a shift in the software to help them, be the backbone software to power their process. I mean, that's where we fit in. That's what we're trying to solve for. But prior to that, these systems were designed 20 years ago for pill making, and they were designed for more compliance and regulatory. They weren't designed for speed to market. And so oftentimes, unfortunately, for better or for worse, a lot of the ways in which these drugs were manufactured, a lot of the ways in which they came to market was still very much paper driven. It's still a paper driven culture, even leading into 2020, that existed in this space. And there's a lot of reasons for it. One, there just wasn't software to really help them have this level of flexibility and speed and frankly, just even modernity around the actual system itself. But the other thing too was because it is a regulated space, that everything in this space is highly regulated. Paper affords itself a level of flexibility, which is really interesting. But there's a portion of paper that is really bad, which is the data. And the feedback loop from paper to back into the process to help make certain smart decisions quickly is very slow and very painful. And so leading into the vaccine, the vaccine just, my gosh, went through such a radical shift in terms of how the processes, the way teams collaborated, the way in which they use that data to make some smart decisions quickly, and how then there was a collaboration with regulatory, which has always been a factor in this whole thing, how there was such a deeply embedded teamwork effort there that they were literally on site with these teams, literally physically there with them, that then all of a sudden really transformed how this drug in particular came to market.
So for those of us in the software development world, like I've used things like Trello, Asana, ClickUp. There's a variety of project management tools. Jira for more software-based development. Why couldn't they? How is Apprentice different from some of those? What are the custom requirements that are different about this industry? And how much of this is cultural? How much of it is just getting people to think about this in a digital way versus you have the best tool that lets them do it?
So interestingly, culture was probably the most difficult challenge we've had over the last 6 years that we've been doing this. We didn't just show up at COVID, right? This is technically now we're moving into year 7 here at Apprentice. It's been a long journey. But one of the most difficult things that we had to overcome were the cultural challenges and the industry shift to have the level of trust, and you'll see where I'm going with this in a second, the level of trust to even use a system like this. And the reason why those other systems necessarily can't be used is that all software in this space is regulated. All software in this space has to comply with what's called good manufacturing practices and other types of regulatory requirements like 21 CFR Part 11 and others. And these regulatory requirements force software to go through a certain process, which then the customer has to then what's called validate the software in order for it to be used in the space. And that validation process is a massive overhead for both the customer and the software company. So if the company itself has not been designed, not just from a software perspective, but from a process, policy, team structure, I mean, you name it, how we test software, how we write requirements for software, how we develop our software, and how we release our software. If a company isn't set up to comply with those standards, even though these other tools exist, they can't actually be used. And that's one of the big challenges in this space is that, in my opinion, this is just my opinion, a lot of companies and software companies and entrepreneurs like myself have stayed out of the space because of the fear of those regulations, the fear of, and the overhead associated with all of it. And for better or for worse, we embraced it. We embraced it wholeheartedly since our inception many years ago. But that's why there's a limiting factor of introducing these tools that you and I use. We use them at Apprentice too. Why there's a limiting factor of bringing that into this world. And so we've adopted those practices. We've adopted that flexibility. We've adopted that kind of the consumerism of enterprise software. We just did it for life sciences now in the kind of structure of the regulations that do exist.
I mean, it certainly proves the point how, as an entrepreneur, doing difficult things creates real value, right? You certainly found an industry with plenty of barriers, but as you've seen, I know that Apprentice has seen really explosive growth, but actually still relatively small compared to the J&Js, Modernas, and other large companies you're working with. And I don't mean to call out your customers, I'm not even sure if they are or aren't, but you can verify. But how did you create confidence that they could trust you for what is one of the most critical things that they're working on ever? Mm-hmm. And in that question, how would you? What advice would you give other entrepreneurs as they're looking to work with large companies and create that level of trust?
So our industry in particular is not very trusting of startups, rightfully so. I mean, honestly, rightfully so. These are drugs.
Startups have risk that's inherent, and they need no risk options.
Exactly, and these are drugs going into people's bodies. The stakes are really high. Like if you screw up a widget, all right, you screwed up a widget. Right. If you screw up a drug, that could potentially lead to death, and that's a really scary thing. So by nature, this industry, is conservative in the approach to new technology, as they should be. So what we did in the very early days of Apprentice is we took a unique approach, which took a long period of time, and it was to start off very small and prove the trust, prove the credibility over a period of time. And I know that, in startups, time is your enemy, because especially when you raise money, the clock starts. The second that cash hits your account, the clock has begun. And creating long-term multi-year relationships is difficult. And so, for example, how did we get here and how did we help specifically some of the contract manufacturers, go through their process this year? Because the vaccine didn't get necessarily fully created in-house at these companies. They had to contract out a lot of the manufacturing because, number one, some of this just didn't exist. But number two, the world didn't have capacity for 8 billion doses or even 600 million here in the United States because you have to take 2 doses. And so because of that, it just had to get farmed out to contract manufacturers. And some of those contract manufacturers, we've had relationships for over 5 years, almost 6 years. And through that multi-year, very long relationship, we started out at like one little site, one little team. and not only proved out the value, but proved out that we as a vendor had the credibility and the actual ability to deliver on our promises. And then fast forward, years later, that same CMO, which I unfortunately can't mention her name, we went from only a few sites around the world to over 45 last year. We had some of our customers where we were in 8 sites around the world going into COVID to then over 70. We had other customers that we weren't even a customer with yet, but because we had the credibility and trust from other big names, we're able to move very rapidly and deploy out in over 20 sites throughout last year. And so it's one of those things where I hate to say it, but we had to kind of go back to basics of building relationships and trust with customers instead of having a product where we're just looking at analytics. How are they using this? And let's look at Google Analytics today and not actually talk to the customer. We built real relationships over years, and to be in a place where we finally were able to kind of deliver for them.
Yeah. I've got to think that in some of because of the stakes being so high, that in some cases you've been, I would imagine you've had relationships up to potentially the CEO. Have there been naysayers in the C-suite that you've turned into supporters? And can you share any examples of those? Maybe that, with or without names is up to you, but I'm curious of how you've created some collaboration.
Absolutely. So I'll use an exact example from the beginning of the pandemic. So we obviously were working with and touching everything from the current vaccine that's currently approved to ones that were in candidate pipeline through the summer, which unfortunately some of those candidates didn't get approval. They didn't show efficacy, unfortunately. But we were working with a whole wide range of folks in many different ways. Some using some of our products, some using others, some through their contract manufacturers, some directly. But beyond the COVID piece, last year, this industry went through a remarkable shock. I mean, we all did, obviously, but there was a big concern about the global drug supply chains and its overall health and the ability to actually produce other life-saving drugs beyond the COVID vaccine last year. So it actually went up to the president of one of our companies that's a $250 billion organization. And it went all the way up to the president of the company. And effectively, they said, how fast can you deploy? And so we had C-suite level decisions at these massive organizations saying, we need you to deploy, we need you to deploy rapidly. And that's where, thankfully, we were in a place where, we had seen this pandemic coming. We had customers in China and we had kind of some glimpses of this. So we retooled our software and our deployment model and all of our capabilities such that then we could deploy at a scale overnight that was really, it was really dramatic. But in that same C-suite where the president of this company, and I wish I really could mention a name, they're here in New Jersey, they're very large for obvious reasons, but in that same group, that same leadership team prior to COVID, there were some challenges there. And we had to convince the global heads of manufacturing, the global heads of IT, the global heads of operations and quality that this actually was a system that could be trusted. Not that it worked, because we proved that years ago, but that could be trusted in their network. And thankfully, we chipped away at the course of multiple years. And so finally, we were in this position where then the president says, go, and we went. And we were able to deploy with confidence, and they were able to support us with confidence. And the rest was history from there. So this is an example, not even during the pandemic of the vaccine itself, but all the other drugs that were getting produced had massive shocks and impacts to the system beyond all of that.
I love that playing the long game paid off, not just for Apprentice, but for such an important part of for society right now. I mean, do you believe? Is it fair to say that if Apprentice was not in place in many of these locations, that it would have taken significantly longer for this vaccine to come to market? Can you make that claim? So
we can definitely make the claim that Apprentice helped. The thing, though, is that they threw massive human resources at this at will. We had one example from one of our customers that said, ordinarily, this is during the clinical trial process last summer. One of these vaccine candidates, unfortunately, didn't make it to market. It didn't have the efficacy, unfortunately. But ordinarily, it takes 90 days to produce one batch of drugs. 90 days. Just one batch. Working with our customer and using a part of our software, they were able to get that one batch of drugs out the door in 12 days. 90 to 12. And this example is really important because we absolutely were enabling technology in that process. Now, granted, did they throw huge human resources at that too? Absolutely. But we were an enabling factor to help them go about and move at the speed in which they needed to. So, I would love to say that we were the enabling factor that helped it speed to market. I can't make that claim, unfortunately, but we sure as heck helped the manufacturing of this during the clinical trials in the summer and now into commercial production. And so that piece of it is something we are quite proud of. But we also are proud of too of what our customers did in terms of just the sheer effort and human energy that was put into this thing. In the backdrop, again, in COVID, we were dealing with COVID, they were dealing with COVID, it was all around them. It's not like they were in some magical bubble that didn't exist. And so, just the sheer effort that they put into it and their energy, that is really what stole the day. We were just there to help support it and help them, use tools to go faster. But they're the heroes of this thing by far, on top of us.
That's awesome. Because it was so rapidly accelerated, there are a lot of people who are nervous about taking it. Even in a hospital system here in New Jersey, I've heard that only 30% of the employees opted in, which I was disappointed to hear and surprised to hear. Can you share, is there any part of your experience in working with the manufacturers that you can share to create any, do you have any insight that lends itself to confidence in people's trust of actually getting vaccinated?
Absolutely. But before I get to that, it's unfortunate. It's just so unfortunate. And this problem didn't start, by the way, during COVID. Our industry, for better or for worse, has a trust problem and has had a trust problem for a long time. And, the folks like Martin Schreckl of the world and others like that have given pharma a pretty tough reputation, and one that is, unfortunately, something that has led to a mistrust in the institutions that actually develop these types of life-saving drugs.
For those who aren't sure, he's talking about the pharma bro who raised the price of that
unfortunately,
drug.
yes.
Who, by the way, also unfortunately has a New Jersey connection. If you weren't aware.
I know. Yeah. For better or for worse.
That's right. For worse. The good and the bad.
And so that's just one example. But I think that because the pricing side of this industry sometimes has crept into the conversation about what the industry actually produces, it's created mistrust coming into this vaccine. So you kind of already, before the vaccine even got out the gate, you're dealing with an industry that already has a perception problem, let's say. And then all of a sudden you accelerate the heck out of the actual production cycle, and it creates fear, because ultimately this industry is very opaque, right? We dealt with it ourselves, which if we weren't in the industry and started this company from on the inside of this industry, it's very hard to understand what this industry even does. It's very hard to understand how drugs are made. It's very hard to understand how you tell if they're safe. It's very hard to understand just what does even the manufacturing process look like? Because when most people think of manufacturing, they think of like Tesla. You can visualize that. You can think about what the robots look like while they're making the Model 3. Do people really know or can visualize how the COVID vaccine is produced and discovered and brought to market?
Definitely not.
No, not at all. And so you have this kind of multiple layers that we dealt with this year of mistrust coming into the vaccine, the opaqueness of the process in general, because it's just so hard to visualize how this thing is even done. And then, you throw in the political environment from last year, and it's a cocktail that is unfortunately, challenging, to say the least. With all that said, I am on the inside of this industry. I do see everything that was done. I do work shoulder to shoulder with the men and women in this industry who did go through unbelievable challenges last year to produce this, but more importantly, to produce it safely. And so this is the piece of it where I hope by what I say, can lend itself to some level of confidence, is coming back to our conversation earlier of the waterfall, right? We had the waterfall, and people are used to hearing about the waterfall, the 10-year waterfall of I do this, then I do that, then I do this, then I do that, then we get to the end. Even though this thing was stacked on top of each other, each of those stacks, each of those pieces of the process still had to go through the same level of rigor that any other drug goes through to go to market. And there were many drugs that did not get approval for this vaccine. I mean, we have customers of ours that we have incredibly deep relationships with that we killed ourselves on through the summer. They did not get approval. The drug was shown to not be effective. And the thing is that means the process worked, right? In the beginning of COVID, there were almost 120 companies racing to get a drug out to market. And from those 100 and some odd companies, we only have 2 approvals. And the reason why is that the process did work. The only difference is it happened in a stack. But in that stack, the layers, the rigor to show safety, the rigor to show efficacy, the safety, the process around the actual way in which this drug was tested to make sure it's safe for human consumption, that still had to happen. And other drugs didn't make it. So our process did work. They didn't race all of this to market all of a sudden, and every single one of these 120 some odd candidates got approved. Only 2 did so far.
And so do you think that go ahead.
Oh, sure. And I was going to say the why those 2 did work is because during their actual clinical trials, the efficacy numbers, I don't want to say are unprecedented because we've seen some good vaccines in the past, but the efficacy numbers from the technique that both Pfizer and Moderna used through mRNA was unprecedented. Like 90 some odd % efficacy out the gate in these clinical trials is remarkable. And not only did it have a high level of efficacy, but there's a whole system designed around adverse effects where every single participant in these clinical trials is tracked unbelievably detailed on every single moment that's happening in his or her life to see if there's something happening in the reaction and the safety of that drug. And these studies were huge. We're talking like tens of thousands of people. Moderna did an unbelievably diverse study. So it's not just people, but it's people of different backgrounds and races and ages and sexes and you name and geography and you name it. The diversity of that study combined with the scale of that study, combined with the rigor of the process, combined with the adverse effects tracking, all of that led to an outcome that had a drug that was found between Pfizer and Moderna, and hopefully soon here on J&J, that was not only safe, but actually effective. And then we'll get into the manufacturing process, which I could speak to in a moment. But that whole thing, is really what happened here and why I believe in the process. I believe in the safety of it. And so many of them failed to get here that what actually got approved is remarkably powerful for what we're trying to do here.
It's pretty incredible. Do you think this is a shift in the industry where it will no longer take 8 to 10 years to bring a vaccine or a drug to market, that because of a shift in culture and technology use that we can bring, I don't know that we can expect that it's a year unless we point all the world of resources at it. But do you believe that this will be a shift in the industry and things will no longer take 8 years to happen?
Without question. And there are certain things that just can't go faster in the future. So for example, the FDA and other international agencies were literally physically installed into these facilities and like they were sitting at the exact same table as the manufacturers at the exact same time, collaborating in real time with each other. And that's not going to happen for every drug going forward. That level of regulatory collaboration, I just don't think that's possible into the future. But what I do think is that the innovations that were found around drug discovery, number one, and the techniques that Moderna and BioNTech/Pfizer used was unbelievably powerful and will absolutely be used into the future. 2, the actual manufacturing process now, the thing that made the drug for the trial, that whole way, they ain't going back. What they found this last year was that things can be done faster while still maintaining the same level of quality and the same level of safety that is required to actually produce that drug. Because that's the other side of the actual drug making itself. How do I know that, okay, the molecule was found, but how do I know it was actually manufactured safely? There are certain critical process parameters and certain critical quality attributes that are tracked with a level of tolerance that is so tight that if it is even out of specification by like many, many small percentages outside of it, that they can't accept that batch of that drug. So the safety around the actual manufacturing process is unbelievably controlled and tight. But with that said, coming back to the learnings from this year, there's no way they're going back to how long it took to qualify equipment, how long it took to tech transfer, how long it took to stand up the manufacturing process, how long it took to actually figure out the manufacturing process, how long it took to actually go about the drug discovery, the clinical trial design. I mean, you name it, we ain't going back.
And by bringing it back to the beginning, right? Which used to be hand me the manila folder with the file, now is pull up Apprentice and let's see where we are in the process so we can collaborate.
And it's not just Apprentice. There were tools in the drug discovery piece of it, the software. So we don't do drug discovery. We do all the manufacturing piece and all that fun stuff. But even the drug discovery tools, they're never going back to doing it the old way, where they literally used to sample, Aaron, like hand by hand, sample by sample, testing the actual, like, well, is this going to work or is that going to work? Is this going to work? Like effectively guess or check at a massive scale. They call it high throughput screening. But the software that was designed to actually create the mRNA vaccine, we're never going back, right? It is just so remarkable how much software touched the whole process. And then you even get to logistics and supply chain and clinical trial design. The clinical trial study participants, that diverse, massively diverse and inclusive study that Moderna did, that whole design was just so different than what they've done before. And so yes, Apprentice is part of this story that they're not going to go back on, but they ain't going back on those other things either.
Yeah. And that's what I love about these industries, right? Where when you see how technology can be so game changing is when the users can say there's a sense of an inevitability, right? Like, of course I should be able to get a taxi to show up in front of my house just using my phone, right? There's this like, of course it should be this way. And it sounds like that's exactly what's happening to this industry here. And there's no turning back. Of course it should be this way, and that software can make it more efficient.
That's exactly right. And so we're very optimistic about the future, and we're very optimistic about not just COVID, but we like to say that Apprentice's goal is to create a lasting impact from COVID to cancer, right? Because all of the learnings of this last year, all of the things that were done, all of the ways in which software can be used across everything, this world that's coming up around personalized medicine and cell and gene therapy, which funny enough, New Jersey is a leader in this space. We have the largest commercial manufacturers of personalized medicine here in New Jersey, in Warren and Summit, New Jersey, and East Hanover, New Jersey. Some of the biggest manufacturers of this in the world are here in New Jersey. And this new world that's coming up requires that these drugs come to market faster in order to be able to deliver for the patients who need them. So for us, we are unbelievably optimistic about this future. And we believe that the learnings from last year are going to be taken into this next wave of drugs coming to market. But it's something that we feel is a requirement to enable this future state where there's personalized medicine designed for me and you, and is a radical shift in this industry. But we think that software and technology can enable it.
Totally agree. And we would echo, in fact, the reason that we drive our better wellness programming, which is part of our Better X alliances throughout the years, because we believe New Jersey is strategically positioned to make such an impact in a few industries. And this is one we deeply believe in, and how technology plays a role. You're the perfect example of that. A couple of quick questions before we let you go. Mm-hmm. When would you predict it will, whether people feel safe or not, but when would you predict it will actually be safe for the general American to go to a sporting event in a large stadium?
Q3
this year.
Yep. And so the reason why I say that is based on the current rate of production schedules, based on what we know we think is going to happen to accelerate the manufacturing process even further. Because effectively where we are right now in the development is we're all waiting for manufacturing, right? Drug's been discovered, drug's been approved, done. We are now just in a stage where the manufacturing process is the limiting factor, and not the process per se, but physical capacity. We're talking actual stainless steel bioreactors and single-use bags, and the physical limitations and facility constraints. That is what is stopping this level of production at a 600 million dose scale, 8 billion dose scale, the global type of scale. With that said, though, Pfizer just, for example, just came out yesterday, and they were able to actually cut down their manufacturing process from over 110 days for one batch, 110 days for one batch, down to about 60 some odd days. So almost in half. And that rate of development, that rate of progress, combined with other capacity coming online. There are multiple facilities right now that are coming online that are being qualified and getting ready to start to run material through the process. And so we believe that the rate of production is going to increase, combined with additional approvals like J&J, who's coming to market, and they should be getting their EUA shortly. But that is a one dose. That is a one dose type of deal where instead of having to create production for 2 doses, which takes 300 million Americans and doubles it, we only need the 300 million. And so when you add up the capacity coming online with the new improvements in the manufacturing process and the actual new drugs, the new vaccines are actually getting approved, we believe that the scale that's required to give ourselves the comfort to go back to somewhat of our daily lives, when you do some of the math on that, and it's aggressive math, trust me, it's very aggressive math. We think the back half of Q3 into Q4-ish, you're talking the September-ish, October-ish timeframe, really starts to increase the level of confidence, we think for going back to normal.
Yeah, and real quick on the J&J piece, I believe I read the efficacy is significantly lower. Does that give you any concern? If you had a choice, would you opt out of the J&J vaccine?
So at this stage, if I had any access to the vaccine, I'm taking it. I unfortunately don't have access to it. I'm in phase 2 here in New Jersey. I get it. I'm young and I'm healthy, and we need people that are much higher risk than I am to be taking this thing, well before I do. Frontline workers. I'm at the last at the end of this line. But if I had the choice, absolutely sign me up, because even that doesn't have the star, studded numbers that, Pfizer and Moderna have, that level of efficacy is still in line with traditional vaccines. And to me, it's how fast can the state of New Jersey, for example, where we are located, how fast can this state get to a state in which which is the sad part of it, if we all have ticked up in the number of people who have had COVID, this kind of herd immunity concept, combined with the number of folks who have been vaccinated, we'll finally get to a stage in which the rate of transmission will drop to the floor. Yeah. And when that part happens, even if the efficacy isn't in that kind of star-studded range, it still is in range with other proven, reliable, safe vaccines. And so me personally, I would take anyone that I'm allowed to, but I'm not there yet. I'm in phase 2. I'm going to be here for a while. So yeah, that's how I feel about it.
For those who want to learn more about Apprentice, where can they find you? And we never actually shared where in New Jersey you're based. So any commercial you'd like to share about Apprentice for those listening and watching?
Yeah, absolutely. So in this last year, we've grown like mad, and we are looking for people to help join our team. This is a big fight. It's a hard fight. It's a challenging fight. And it's not over once COVID is solved. This industry, like we've talked about for the last half an hour here, has some big challenges well beyond COVID. And so we are growing our team quite dramatically right here in the state of New Jersey. Our offices are located in Jersey City, New Jersey. But currently we are at home, and I'm in Warren, New Jersey, which isn't too far away in the mythical central New Jersey that may or may not exist. No one really knows. But really excited if folks are looking to join our team, because we're looking for help. Wide range of roles, from engineering, of course, to quality, to QA, to sales, to customer success, to shipping, to kind of everything in between. And so we're looking for folks to help join the team and join the fight, and do it right here in New Jersey.
Awesome. Angelo, I really appreciate you being part of the TechUnited New Jersey community. As you know, our mission is to empower entrepreneurs to build a better future for all. And I think you're such a fantastic example of that, you and the team at Apprentice. So thrilled you're doing it here in New Jersey, and thrilled you're doing it, for the good of mankind in general. So usually last year, our move, we only have limited moves here, was the high five the camera. This time, you can high five to your left. I'm going to go to my left on the count of 3. Oh, sorry, my right. 1, 2, 3. Boom. That'll have to do.
Close enough.
Thanks so much for being with us today. Really appreciate it. And we'll see you soon.
Thanks, Aaron.